It is unfortunate that the medieval European period is often depicted as a period of gloomy darkness, cultural stagnation, and intellectual backwardness. Often in mass media, there is virtually no distinction between the Viking period starting in the late 8th century of the Common Era and the Italian Renaissance flourishing in the early 16th century. It's as if a pause button were hit for 1,000 years. Of course, this period could just as well be described as one of rapid technological innovation, an architecture brimming with light, and an intellectual and spiritual world marked by intense dynamism and sophistication. The same failure to appreciate the dynamism and development of the medieval period is also very pronounced when it comes to our understanding of the religious and spiritual life of this period. One struggles to call to mind anything other than the image of the tonsured monk struggling to copy some obscure work in his freezing cell, or the similarly canon image of the pious, silent, obedient woman. Typically, we don't hear the voices of women or gender nonconforming people from this period, not because they did not speak, but because they were silenced or simply ignored. Such stereotypes are shattered by the radical, novel, and intense mystical sophistication of the Beguines. In this episode of Esoterica, we're going to explore this dynamic form of mysticism dominated by ingenious and profound women who have left behind some of the most incredible mystical literature in world history. This episode is also special because it's a collaboration with my colleague Philip Holm over at Let's Talk Religion. Philip holds a master's degree in religious studies and specializes in comparative religion, specifically on Islam and its mystical current, Sufism. I'll be covering several women from the mystical Beguine tradition, and he'll be breaking a similar stereotype about the role of women in Islamic mysticism. Make sure to check out his episode, his channel, and make sure to subscribe to his really high quality content. From the erotic devotion of Hadewijch of Antwerp, to the flowing light of Mechthild of Magdeburg, to the Gnostic annihilation that cost Marguerite Porete her life to the flames of the Inquisition, let's explore the sublime mysticism of the Beguines. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. The 13th century is among the most dynamic intellectual and spiritual periods of European history. This was the century of the Italian mathematician Fibonacci, the theologian Thomas Aquinas, the saga writer Snorri Sturluson, the scientist Roger Bacon, and the composer of the Zohar and the originator of the Kabbalah, Moshe de Leon. This was also a period marked by intense spiritual revival, reform, and upheaval. This was the period of the Cathars and their extermination, the movement of the free spirit, and the rise of an intense lay spirituality led by women who were called themselves Beguines. The name Beguine remains mysterious, and to this day there are several conflicting and often pejorative origins given for this name. What we do know is that the movement began to flourish sometime in the early 13th century in the Low Countries, what is now called Belgium and the Netherlands. Here, women inspired by the revivalist Vita Apostolica, or the desire to live in simplicity and religious devotion, much like the early followers of Jesus described in the book of Acts, began to form communities of mutual aid to facilitate a life of devotion, service to the community, and economic independence. It's important to note here that the Beguines were not nuns. The vows they took were imposed on themselves by themselves, and in this sense they were autonomous in the strict sense of the word. They ruled themselves by their own law, and were thereby free to leave the community as they saw fit, to marry, or perhaps to join an enclosed community and become proper nuns. These were lay women who, on their own initiative, took upon themselves a spiritual vocation of piety and service. Also, despite much medieval slander, these women did not provide for their communities by begging or seeking alms. Rather, they tended to work in urban centers, and often worked in various fields such as money changing, the linen industry, as professional calligraphers and scribes, and medical experts among many other skilled trades. Beguines sought to live their religious devotion much as Jesus did. They tended to the sick, they provided comfort and protection for sex workers, they engaged in public education for the masses, but especially for children. The Grey Sisters, as they were sometimes called, were also effusive and charismatic preachers. This communal lifestyle proved incredibly popular among women, and Beguinages began to appear on record in the very early 13th century. By the early 13th century, Beguinages had appeared in France, Germany, Spain, and beyond, with the use of vernacular names and titles to describe the communities and the women that lived in them. Needless to say, the existence of autonomous, powerful, and charismatic communities of women were certainly polarizing in 13th century Christendom. Some nobles, clerics, and bishops met the movement with enthusiasm, while others reviled them as uncouth, loose women, or worse, heretics to be suppressed. The Beguines also produced a series of unique theologians and mystics, whose vernacular works remain as impressive and shocking today as they did when the quill first hit parchment in the 13th century. In this episode, I want to introduce you to 3 of these mystics. No doubt, my brief analysis will fail to capture the rich mystical experiences and theologies of these amazing women, but I hope it will inspire you to research them more closely yourself. And hopefully here at Esoterica, I'll have the chance to come back to each one of these amazing mystics in turn. Among the earliest literary Beguines was Beatrice of Nazareth, who flourished sometime in the very early 13th century. While we know a good bit about her life, very little of her writing actually survived, sadly. What does remain is a short essay entitled On the 7 Ways of Holy Love, which sets the stage for much of later Beguine mysticism. The major scholar of Christian mysticism, Bernard Magin, has forcefully argued that the core concepts of Beguine mysticism include love or minna, insanity or madness, and spiritual annihilation. All of these themes can certainly be seen in the sublime mystic Hadewijch of Antwerp. Sadly, we know virtually nothing about Hadewijch's life. Indeed, even her literary output was virtually unknown outside of a couple of monasteries until the late 19th century. It appears that she was born into an aristocratic family somewhere near Antwerp in the early 13th century. She had command of several languages, including Latin and French, and was intimately acquainted with the courtly love poetry of her day. Hadewijch's literary output is nothing short of impressive. Numerous letters, poems, and a book of visions of literary sophistication and spiritual intensity. It appears that she was at some point in a leadership position in her Beguinage, but apparently fell out with them for reasons that aren't terribly clear. At this point, it seems like she became an itinerant Beguine somewhere near the end of her life, although when and how she died has been lost to history. The core of Hadewijch's mysticism is her radical insistence on the fundamental reality of love, or minna. Relying on the gospel quotation that God is love, Hadewijch creates a kind of syllogism, that if God is love, and that God is the ground of being, then love itself must be the most fundamental ontological register. To this metaphysical conception, Hadewijch deploys the court poetry of her time, in which the lover pines intensely for the impossible beloved. But here, the gender roles are reversed, with Hadewijch taking on the role of the noble or the knight, with God or Jesus becoming the object of that courtly love. This is a kind of radical feminization of the divine. In one of her core teachings, she analyzes the 7 names of love. This is no tame notion, however. For Hadewijch, love is a kind of madness or insanity, which possesses, transforms, and tortures the lover. Surpassing even the light of love is love in its highest form. Love is a kind of hell in which the lover is racked with an agony of pure and infinite desire. Here, Hadewijch argues that love must be forsaken in order to have love at all. Even love for the sake of love is simply too impure for her. And it is in this radical unfaith that so utterly empties out the soul of the lover that this abyss of the soul, or deep height as she calls it, becomes unified with the divine abyss itself. In this radical abyssal love, there is no distinction between the soul and God, and this is a theme that, as you might imagine, certainly worried many Orthodox theologians. We know a bit more about the life of Mechthild of Magdeburg. Born in 1208, Mechthild began to have visions, or what she called greetings, sometime around the age of 12. Around 1230, she became a Beguine at Magdeburg, and, like Hadewijch, appears to have risen to a leadership position. In 1272, toward the end of her life, with her health failing, she joined a Cistercian nunnery. She remained there to the end of her life, although we don't know exactly when or how she died. Mechthild's work, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, was originally composed in her own native Middle Low German, but the original has sadly been lost. Translations into Middle High German and Latin were, however, performed in her lifetime. The Flowing Light of the Godhead is a richly complex text, which Mechthild composed over the entire course of her life. The book justifies itself as emerging directly from God, as a kind of new gospel. and urges its readers to read it at least 9 times if they're going to understand it. The majority of the text takes the form of a dialogue between various entities such as soul, reason, and love. Other parts of the text are written in a kind of lyrical poetry popular in her day, giving those sections a kind of popular working-class drinking song feel, despite the fact they're full of mystical insights. Unsurprisingly, the central image of Mechthild's work are those of intense, dynamic, flowing light. Here, the light of the Trinity, itself marked by a surging sense of dynamism, pours light into the soul, thus illuminating it. Mechthild often speaks of the, quote, game of love as an erotic seduction of the soul by the Trinity. Her images are frank. They abound with kissing, embracing, nakedness, and consummation on the bed of love. This is a divine eroticism par excellence. Whereas many mystics talk about an ascent to the divine, Mechthild's mysticism is one of sinking. Here the mystic sinks deeper and deeper into an erotic longing or mystical despair, wherein the moment of being perfectly estranged from God, so deep that she refers to this hellish alienation as being under the tail of Lucifer himself, that there in that profound primordial nothingness can be the thing that is beyond all thingness, and that of course is God. The mystical vertigo here is profound. It is only in the nothingness that is the groundless ground for all being that the empty nothingness of the soul sunk into that nothingness can actually be saved. And it is only in the unity of the nothingness of God and the nothingness of the soul that is, for Mechthild, salvation itself. This is an image of a divine, dark nothingness that is nothing other than the flowing light of illumination and salvation. Marguerite Porete is without a doubt the most tragic figure we'll discuss, with her execution by burning on the 1st of June 1310 marking the very end of the golden age of the Beguines. Marguerite was born somewhere in northern France, although we're not quite sure where, and very few details of her early life are known. She seems to have been high-born, but had a very difficult relationship with both church officials, local authorities, and even other local Beguines. She was likely an itinerant Beguine, among the most vulnerable of this population. What we do know is that she was arrested sometime in the 1290s by the Inquisition for the publication and dissemination of her mystical text. In years after refusing to even respond to the Inquisition's questions, she was found guilty of being a relapsed heretic and burned. Such bravery reveals her character and her dedication to the mystical truths revealed in her book, whose entire title is The Mirror of Simple Souls Who Are Annihilated and Remain Only in Will and Desire of Love. The mirror, like many mystical texts, is very difficult to summarize. The bulk of the text is a dialogue between reason and love, in which love yearns to employ and then overcome reason in its desire for mystical annihilation. The text provides a kind of 7-stage esoteric itinerary for the soul, by which the soul itself becomes increasingly purified through the travails of various forms of erotic mystical love. Here Marguerite employs a series of dialectical paradoxes or exchanges, such as being nothing, sin, salvation, ascent, descent, and emptying and filling. Through all of these dialectical exchanges, the soul reaches higher and higher to the coincidence of opposites itself, God, which Marguerite often refers to as, with her own word, the far near. The soul must pass through this process of sheaving off its somethingness in order to reach the abyssal nothingness, which is the divine being itself. This involves a spiritual and practical process of learning to live, quote, without a why, in which the soul is increasingly emptied out, such that its nothingness can be annihilated by the nothingness of the Godhead. It is in God alone that all of these contradictions are resolved, through the annihilation of the soul and the divine nothingness. The notion that salvation can be achieved only through a kind of non-action, and the idea that Marguerite herself was a kind of co-salvific figure with Christ, were certainly grist for the mill of the Inquisition. Though she was also a victim of the politics of her age. Recall, this is also the time period in which the Templars were marked for destruction, and the French state was increasingly looking to tighten its relationship with Rome. The execution of Marguerite Porete in some sense signaled the end of the golden age of the Beguines. Only a year after her execution, the Council of Vienne was convened, and it was declared that the Beguines themselves were introducing opinions contradictory to the Catholic Church, and they were precariously closely related with the movement of the Free Spirit, a movement marked deeply heretical. By the mid-14th century, the golden age of the Beguines was certainly over. Many communities were absorbed into adjacent enclosed communities. and the age of the Reformation devastated Catholic communities in Northern Europe, including the remnants of any Beguinages. Yet, amazingly, the Beguines did survive, though in very small numbers. Marcella Patten, the last traditional Beguine, died on the 14th of April 2013 at the Beguinage at Kortrijk in Belgium, bringing a close a history of spirituality, mysticism, service, devotion, resistance, and women's autonomy stretching back 800 years. It is difficult not to marvel at the Beguines. When I was living in Amsterdam, I always counted myself lucky when I could pull back the wooden door of the Beguinehof there and breathe in the quiet and history of these amazing women. And I have to admit, even as a non-Christian person, the spirituality and mystical insights of these profound women is nothing other than stunning and inspiring. If you're interested in the history of mysticism, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. It's one of the central themes of our channel, along with the history of magic, alchemy, Kabbalah, and so much more. Also, perhaps you'll consider supporting us on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Also, make sure to check out the companion to this video over at Let's Talk Religion, where Philip's going to be describing the world of Sufi women mystics. So head over there and make sure to tell him hi for me. The best way to experience Beguine mysticism is by reading their actual works, which are actually surprisingly accessible. The complete works of all the Beguine mystics I mentioned in this episode can be found in their respective volumes in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. The introductions to these texts are also very comprehensive, well-written, and deeply sympathetic, while remaining very scholarly. There are copious notes, and the translations are all very solid. Further, these texts can be found online, sometimes only for a couple of dollars, so they're very much worth picking up. The best major study in English of the Beguines is in Bernard McGinn's second volume of his magisterial history of Christian mysticism. This volume, The Flowering of Mysticism, covers both Beguines and enclosed women mystics of the 13th century. It's a substantial, thoughtful tome, very well written, and worth having. Finally, if you want a short, accessible introduction to the Beguines, the best text is Laura Swan's The Wisdom of the Beguines. She covers the whole movement in a very popular style, including the mystics we've talked about in this episode. I read the whole book in one afternoon because it was so engrossing, well-written, sympathetic, and thoughtful, so I'd highly recommend picking that up if you want an introduction to the Beguines themselves. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.